everyone. Now, I know that it's hard to keep up on top of what's going on in the Holy Land, but if you want to know more about what's happening here in Israel, I'm Aaron Porras, and this is the Weekly Review.
As largely expected he would, Israeli President Isaac Herzog granting an extension to construct a coalition to Prime Minister-elect Benjamin Netanyahu. Though, as opposed to the maximum 14 days possible, Herzog only giving Netanyahu 10 days. So the Likud leader will have until December 21 to finalize agreements between his party and those of his right-wing and religious partners. But in light of concerns over the ideological views of his partners and the appointments thus far reported, Herzog reportedly awarding the 10-day extension with a warning attached. Herzog indicating that Bibi's government, quote, must work for the entire public of Israel, and that it needs to take into account potential damages to Israel's democratic checks and balances, breaches to the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, and unity with Jews still overseas in the diaspora. This in light of the coming coalition's determination to pass the so-called override bill, which would sharply limit the High Court of Justice's abilities to block legislation that seems contradictory to Israel's basic laws. In a letter sent to Netanyahu, the president writing, quote, "These are complex times for Israeli society as differences over core issues threaten to stoke violence and blind hatred. And the coalition being formed must maintain a respectful and responsible dialogue between the authorities, executive, legislative, and judicial." Meanwhile, the next biggest challenge actually in finding a new Speaker of the Knesset in order to quickly introduce the override bill for a vote. But already, angry over Netanyahu's giving away of top ministry positions to other parties and apparent newcomers, longtime Likud lawmakers pressuring Bibi from all sides to reward them. In response, Netanyahu said weighing a rotational agreement for the position of foreign minister and for the positions of Knesset Speaker, Justice Minister, and Defense Minister, among others, Netanyahu will likely appoint those who are seen as rising against his leadership in a move to quash rebellion. On the question of ultra-Orthodox military service, United Torah Judaism chair and likely incoming head of the Knesset Finance Committee, Moshe Gafni, is now coming up with an apparent halfway compromise. Gafni is indicating that he is fine with yeshiva students enlisting into the IDF, so long as non-Charedim in turn study Torah. Gafni explaining that, quote, "When there were bloody wars during the reign of King David, a prophet came to him and said that half the people will study Torah and half will serve in the army, and then they'll switch. So I suggest that Ponevez's yeshiva students will go to the army, to combat roles, but at the same time bring high school children to study Torah. If that's done, then it's a deal," end quote. The question is then, how serious is this suggestion? Looking into the context of the proposal, some critics are pointing to the Haredi Party's ultimate goal of enshrining Torah study into Israel's basic laws on par with national service. And if recognized as such, all yeshiva students in effect would be exempted from service, because it's unlikely that all secular students would shift their studies to an agreed-upon degree.
Now, some good news coming from Germany, just a few days passing since news breaking out about the far-right coup planning to overthrow the German government, and now government officials approving Germany's first ever program specifically designed to fighting anti-Semitism and promoting Jewish life. The National Strategy Against Anti-Semitism and for Jewish Life being approved by the entire German cabinet at the end of the week and presented in Berlin by Felix Klein, Germany's anti-Semitism commissioner, highlighting the best practices and recommending new political and societal actions. The new German government strategy outlining 5 areas of focused data gathering, research and accurate assessment of anti-Semitism, education as a preventative measure, novel approaches to Holocaust remembrance, enhancing security, and making both present-day and historical Jewish life in Germany visible. The new strategy is a response to the European Union's call to the action from 2021, encouraging member states to submit national anti-Semitic prevention plans by the end of 2022.
Heavy clashes between Israel and Palestinian terrorist militants reported in Jenin overnight as Israeli troops, including some who were undercover, raiding a Jenin business late Sunday evening. 3 Palestinians reported wounded and arrested along with an M16 in the clashes as Israeli forces coming under live fire and explosives. A local wing of Palestinian Islamic Jihad terror members confirming their encounter with the Israelis. Then in other overnight arrest raids, some 18 Palestinian terror suspects detained. No IDF troops were injured during the mission. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of a Palestinian teenager who at this time seems to have been caught in the Jenin crossfire. She was reportedly found dead by gunfire on her roof at her home in the city. The Israeli military acknowledging that they are aware of the 16-year-old's death and that an investigation is underway. Meanwhile, a Palestinian man who hit a motorcyclist in Tel Aviv last Thursday is now believed to have had nationalistic motives. The Shin Bet and Israel police upgrading the suspected traffic accident to suspected car ramming terror attack. This after the 31-year-old Palestinian driver had arrived to Tel Aviv illegally from Judea and Samaria in a stolen vehicle, and the victim, Gilad Tanami, saying that he knew it was a terror attack by the behavior of the driver. Speaking from his bed at Ichilov Hospital, Tanami saying, quote, "I looked up and saw a car accelerating in my direction, and then he continued driving with me and my motorcycle under the vehicle for about 40 meters until he got stuck on a pole."
Joining me now with more on the overnight raids in Jenin, CEO and founder of the Israel Defense and Security Foundation, Brigadier General Reserves, Amir Avivi. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, what more can you tell us about the raid in Jenin last night? It seems like it's a big operation, judging by the number of forces involved and how several were apparently undercover until the operation unfolded.
Well, we have to remember that these operations are always done according to very accurate intelligence, usually brought to the army by the Shabak. Jenin is a very complex region, mostly dominated by Islamic Jihad, an organization that is funded by Iran and is a proxy of Iran. We know that the Palestinian Authority is no more controlling this region. It hasn't been controlling it for the last year. So the combat in this region is intensifying all the time. And the IDF is sending together with the Border Patrol the most elite units, some of them in disguise, in a pinpoint operation to catch terrorists that we know that are about to launch a terror attack against Israelis, whether it's in Judea and Samaria or in major cities along the coast.
Right,
so this is what we saw this night. Every time they go in, it's not just apprehending the terrorists, it's also fighting on the way in and out against armed terrorists.
All right, now, just hours ago, there was actually another attack on Islamic Jihad in Jenin. The terror group is blaming Israel for a car bombing, as it seems to have targeted members of the Islamic Jihad engineering unit. On a macro scale, what do these raids and other recent operations like them mean in the fight against Palestinian terror groups, particularly those like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad?
Well, what we see overall is that all the terror organizations, including Iran, that is weaponizing and funding these terror organizations, are concentrated on Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem, and especially in the northern part. In this region, basically, the Palestinian Authority is not controlling the area. And then we see Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and other groups that have been working together with them, including groups from the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that have detached basically from the PLO and are working alongside the Islamic Jihad. Now, they are working very hard on trying to produce car bombs and explosive devices, just as we saw in the terrible attack we saw in Jerusalem a few weeks ago, with 2 explosive devices. And of course, our intelligence is trying to really uncover these cells and arrest them or attack them.
All right, now, an argument can be made in that the more Israel uses a so-called heavy hand, the more enemies pop up. And in that same vein, when a vacuum is created, new groups erupt like the Lion's Den terror organization in Jenin. How do you respond? Is Operation Breaking the Wave having the intended effect or creating more enemies?
I think that without this operation, nobody's life in Israel would be normal. The fact that overall everyday life in Israel goes on is because of this operation. Without it, we would have been in a terrible situation. And I think that the operation is very successful. Now, there is a lot of incitement everywhere in the Palestinian society. There is a lot of funding and terror initiative, and we have to deal with it. And the only way to do it is to continue and operate all the time, every time we have intelligence go in, we are not punishing the whole society. We don't see large-scale attacks on the cities. Everything that is done is really preemptive according to very, very accurate intelligence and against specific terrorists. And when we go in, if other people shoot at us, then we'll respond, and that's what we do. Now, we have to say a good word to the Shabak and the IDF again and again. They operate in this very complex area, and 99.9% of these operations are extremely successful. And going in and out, managing to do the job and without any soldier hurt, this is an excellent operation for the IDF and the Shabak.
All right, Brigadier General Reserves Amir Avivi, thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Written in Arabic and addressed to Syrian army soldiers, the leaflets bearing a silhouette of an eagle, the symbol for the IDF's 210th Bashan Division, which is in charge of defending Israel's northern border with Syria. And though the IDF refusing to comment publicly on the papers, the text appearing to show the IDF taking responsibility for the strikes overnight and saying, quote, "Time after time, you've been responsible for the harm caused by your decisions. The continuing presence of Hezbollah in the area of Tel Al-Khalib and collaboration with Hezbollah has brought and will bring you nothing good. The presence of Hezbollah in the area has brought you humiliation, and you are paying the price for it," end quote. Now, meantime, this apparent IDF warning coming just days after Israel sending a similar message to Hezbollah directly. Jerusalem reportedly warning of a direct attack on the Beirut International Airport should Iran continue to be allowed to ship weapons to Hezbollah aboard civilian aircraft. But rather than complying, Hezbollah apparently just relocating its militants and arms from army installations near Damascus in eastern Syria, the terror group instead transporting weapons and munitions to more heavily fortified storehouses in fear of Israeli attack. The vote to install a new Knesset speaker delayed at the last minute from Monday to Tuesday, current Prime Minister Lapid and his partners threatening to filibuster, with news that they may continue to threaten filibuster again. And without a new Knesset speaker, Netanyahu and his allies cannot bring to a vote the three changes needed to fulfill coalition agreements between them, among which the so-called override bill, which would enable Netanyahu to appoint MKs with criminal and corruption charges to serve as ministers, like Shas party head Aryeh Deri. And this brings us to the second, arguably more important move against the new government. Lapid saying that his party would seek to bar 4 lawmakers from voting on the bill, arguing that Deri, Netanyahu, and at least 2 other Likud members, quote, had a serious conflict of interest due to the criminal indictments against them. And if Lapid's bid to the Knesset legal staff is successful, Netanyahu's bloc would be short of a majority to pass the bills they want.
Now, the Biden administration is finally listening to Congress, American Jewish groups, and his own administration affiliates in announcing the formation of a new interagency coalition to counter anti-Semitism. The decision coming after several groups urging for a quote-unquote whole government approach, as similarly called for during Second Gentleman Emhoff's roundtable event at the White House last week, and in a bipartisan letter, of course, signed by some 125 lawmakers as well. The letter reading that, quote, because many individual agencies play a critical role in combating anti-Semitism, closer coordination is needed to share best practices and intelligence and to identify gaps, streamline overlapping roles, and execute a unified national strategy. Then as for the new coalition's tasks, its first order of business is reportedly to develop a national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, including raising understanding about its threat to Jews and to all Americans. Then the strategy will be to address anti-Semitic harassment and abuse online and offline, to prevent attacks, and to encourage the building of a more inclusive nation. That said, even as Jews continue to be attacked at a vastly disproportionate rate in the United States, the White House is adding that the new agency will also notably look at countering other types of discrimination, specifically Islamophobia.
Within hours of swapping the Knesset speaker, Israel's incoming coalition advancing 4 key bills through preliminary votes and taking one more giant leap towards assuming office. The legislation seen as a precondition for agreeing to form a government. But several of the bills seen as highly controversial, with some coalition members even voting against, not least because some of them change Israeli basic law for what critics say amount to personal politics or ideology, and not one passing with more than a slim 52% majority. The first, expanding the authority of the power over police in order to establish the National Security Ministry for Otzma Yehudit head Itamar Ben-Gvir. The second, empowering an MK from the religious Zionism party, most likely incoming Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, to helm an independent office in the Defense Ministry in control of building in Judea and Samaria. Then the third allows those serving suspended sentences, like Shas leader Aryeh Deri, to serve not only as a minister, but to control 3 ministries. And the fourth, a bill that would more heavily sanction an MK for leaving their faction. Temporary Speaker Yariv Levin saying he wants to finalize all 4 laws by next week. Meantime, critics also calling out the coming coalition for its reported acquiescence to religious demands. This after an unsourced and so far unverified report on Israeli news alleging extreme demands within coalition agreements from the United Torah Judaism Party. Demands including the expansion of religious gender-segregated beachfronts, gender-segregated public events and spaces, including buses and even libraries, a ban on mixed-gender prayer at the Kotel or the Western Wall, even in the egalitarian space, and a ban on energy production on the Sabbath. But Prime Minister-designate Benjamin Netanyahu dismissing such concerns and pledging to maintain the status quo.
אני רוצה להרגיע אתכם, אולי זה ירגיע אתכם, אולי לא תצעקו כל כך הרבה. יש ויהיה חשמל בשבת, יש ויהיו חופי רחצה לכולם. אנחנו נשמור על הסטטוס קוו, איש באמונתו יחיה. לא תהיה פה מדינת הלכה, תהיה פה מדינה שבה נדאג לכל אזרחי ישראל בלי יוצא מן הכלל. נבחרנו להוביל בדרך שלנו, דרך של הימין הלאומי ודרך של הימין הליברלי, וכך נעשה. תודה רבה לכם.
IDF Chief of Staff Aviv Kochavi made the rare confirmation of an Israeli Air Force strike on the 25-vehicle convoy. Israeli intelligence uncovered which truck in the convoy was carrying Iranian weapons after it crossed into Syria from Iraq. Pilots had to evade surface-to-air missiles fired at them. The strike reportedly killed 10 people, including an unknown number of Iranians.
יכולנו לא לדעת לפני מספר שבועות על השיירה הסורית שעוברת מעיראק לסוריה. יכולנו לא לדעת מה יש בה, ויכולנו לא לדעת שמתוך 25 מסעיות, זאת המסעית, מסעית מספר 8, היא המסעית עם האמל"ח. וגם לשם צריך לשלוח את הטייסים, הם צריכים לדעת להתחמק מטילי הקרקע האוויר.
At the time of the incident, the IDF refused to comment in line with its policy of not confirming specific strikes in Syria. Israel has acknowledged carrying out hundreds of strikes on targets inside Syria in recent years, targeting arms shipments of Iranian allied groups, including Lebanon's terrorist Hezbollah. Israeli strikes continue in Syrian airspace, largely controlled by Russia, even as ties between Jerusalem and Moscow are at odds over Israel's support for Ukraine since the Russian invasion.
A health tech challenge winner. IKNOW detects positive and negative caregiver behavior by processing video feeds from CCTV using AI and computer vision algorithms.
I was selected to be the finalist at the challenge by Henry Ford to reduce burnout. And we pitched our solution, which is based also on some research that shows that there's a direct link between aggression and violence to staff burnout. And luckily we won, so I was pretty happy about it.
Segi's Prize will see his product piloted to work with Henry Ford Health to further develop their solution and enter the US market.
COVID was difficult for everyone, especially healthcare systems. Nursing really took it on the chin with this, and there are 3 million nursing vacancies in the US alone. We are trying to make their life a little bit easier, make their work more efficient, more rewarding, and safer. We want to move the ball in nursing care.
Henry Ford Health partnered with Startup Nation Central to create the Tech Challenge.
I was introduced to Startup Nation a decade ago as a partner for us to solve healthcare's biggest challenges. We've worked pretty extensively with them. This is our second challenge that we have done, and I'd like to say the most successful one to date. But they've introduced us to hundreds of companies here in the state of Israel.
Sharon leads the global healthcare activities at SNC. She explained how they help innovative companies collaborate.
We looked for early-stage Israeli startup, and this is our way to find business opportunity for Israeli startup with the U.S. Healthcare organization and create more and more opportunity for them to penetrate the U.S. market.
The other 4 finalists included an AI-based optimization tool, an app that logs reports by speech, and bots that safely deliver medicine.
I have over 20 years experience in healthcare, and I experienced it personally, this problem, the problems of medication errors. And so this solution came to me from the field. Our product identify pills, identify capsules and other medications, and identify patients. So it's very hard to do error with our solution.
This marks the second challenge collaboration between Startup Nation Central and Henry Ford.
I've always enjoyed coming and using the vast intellect of the innovation ecosystem here in Israel, rivaled across the world in that as problem solvers for us. We don't have all the answers in that, and I'm hoping to get some great and bright answers that we can implement initially in our hospital and ultimately globally.
And they're expecting many more tech challenges to come in the future.
Published just in time for Hanukkah, archaeologists discovering a massive cache of 2,200-year-old silver coins near the Dead Sea, which experts say is the first in-situ physical evidence of Jews fleeing to the Judean desert prior to the Maccabean revolt against King Antiochus IV Epiphanes. As part of the find in a cave in the Daraga Stream Nature Reserve, an impeccably preserved wooden box with a purple-dyed fabric, some wool stuffing, and 15 silver tetradrachma coins, which in today's terms would have been equivalent to about $10,000. So IAA official Eitan Klein explaining that in general, when we find a cache of coins like this, it tells the story of war. People don't otherwise run off and hide their life savings. Further, again, with the coins dating back to around 170 BCE, the time of Egyptian King Ptolemy VI, the evidence is perfectly corroborating the biblical story of the Hanukkah revolts, and for the first time in its original hiding place, as opposed to on the antiquities market after having been looted and disconnected from its archaeological context.
The latest coin in the hoard was dated to 170 BCE. That's a very special moment in the history of the land of Israel. Actually, it's before the decrees of Antiochus against the Jewish religion. They fled to hiding places in the desert. Eventually, the Seleucids went after them and killed all of them. A report came to the king's men and to the forces in Jerusalem, the city of David, that men who had violated the command of the king had gone down to the hiding places in the desert.
And that's it for ILTV's Weekly Review. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next week.